Welcome back. In the last lecture, we understood Michael Sandel's criticism of Rawls. In this lecture, we are going to understand Michael Walzer's criticism of Rawls. Michael Walzer or Michael Walzer, in his book Spheres of Justice, gave his idea of complex equality. Complex equality. To summarize Michael Walzer in one quote, I will I will say this. To summarize Walzer in one quote, I will say this, that justice is not science of homogenization. Justice is not science of homogenization, but art of differentiation. Justice is not science of homogenization, but art of differentiation. What does this mean? This quote basically means that justice should not be homogenized, as simple as that. Justice should not be universalized, as simple as that. And very preliminary, in the first view, you can sense that he wants to say justice will differ from society to society, right? Justice will differ from society to society. But this preliminary idea, right? From this code, we can understand very simply. We can understand he wants to say justice will differ from society to society. When you go deep, and but he does not limit himself from societal level. That between different societies there are different conceptions of justice. But he goes within a society, that between different spheres of economy, polity, of education, of family, of any kind of sphere, you see, there should be there should be different conception of justice as well. Within family, within economy, within polity, there should be different conception of justice as well. So justice is not science of homogenization, but art of differentiation, right? The first part is basically criticism of Rawls' theory of justice, science of homogenization. First part is, right, I am this part that I have circled is basically criticism of Rawls' theory of justice and Rawls giving universal idea of justice based on dignity, right? Justice is not science of homogenization. So homogenization basically is criticism of Rawls, whereby Rawls gives a universal conception of justice in form of dignity. Human dignity for him is a foundational principle of his theory of justice. Alright. So this foundational principle theory of justice is number one, deontological. Why it is deontological? Because it keeps a singular principle at its core. It is universalist, because Rawls says that his conception of justice is applicable in all of the societies, and it is transcendental. Transcendental basically mean across time. This principle of justice based on dignity will remain true, right? Against universalism, against deontology, against transcendentalism, communitarianism, communitarian philosophers will say that. right? Or very particularly, Walzer will say that you cannot have deontology with respect to justice. You cannot keep a principle as foundational across universe. You cannot give an idea which transcends time, right? And communitarianism or communitarians like Walzer will say that you should not impose universal principle, right? Universal principle should not be imposed, not be imposed. And I will write this word, and this word will explain rest of the things. Universal principle will not be imposed. Basically, communitarians say that we should go for relativism. Very important word, relativism. In rights, we are going to understand this word in more detail. So, relativism. What relativism basically mean that you cannot keep a principle absolute to all societies. An absolute principle cannot be there. You have to see things in relative lens. A principle of justice which can work in Indian society cannot work in Pakistani society. A principle of justice which works in West cannot work in East or cannot work in Islamic Middle East. This idea of relativism we are going to unfold in more detail in rights, in human rights debate, and Mahathir Mohamad and Lee Kuan Yew, all those people we are going to understand with respect to relativism and cultural relativism. For now, it is enough to know that universal principle cannot be applied absolutely on all societies. This relativism has antonym of absolutism. Relativism is basically antonym of absolutism. So universal principle cannot be applied absolutely on all societies, right? When universal principle cannot be applied universally and absolutely on all societies, what Walzer suggests, what Walzer suggests that that communitarians or societies should, not communitarians or societies, but what I was saying, universal principle cannot be applied absolutely on all societies. So what we should do, what basically we should do is find principles which are relevant to those societies, right? This is first principle. The second principle is find principles which are relevant to those societies. Second principle is that justice or principle of justice do not vary from society to society, but within other spheres of society as well. What does this mean, spheres? We are going to understand his principle of complex equality and spheres of justice in equality as well. But for now, what is important that his the principle of justice should vary from society to society, but also within other spheres of society. For he basically says that equality, economy, polity, education system, family system, religious system, all these spheres which should have different principles of justice, right? And he says that keeping dignity as its foundational principle of justice. Foundational principle of justice. This idea that dignity is foundational principle of justice, it is simple equality. What is simple equality? What is complex equality? We are going to understand in equality, right? Keeping dignity as foundational principle of justice is simple equality. What Walzer suggests is complex equality, whereby we have different principle of justice in different spheres of society, right? In different spheres of society. For this, there is this very famous quote of Walzer that different different goods ought to be suggested differently. That different goods ought to be suggested differently in accordance to different spheres and in different societies by different agents. Right? I will write this quote. He says that different goods ought to be distributed differently in accordance to different spheres in different societies by different agents. This quote we will understand in more detail in equality and Michael Walzer's concept of complex equality. For now, just understand that in different spheres of life, in different spheres of society, we should have different ideas of justice, which means that justice should be particularist with respect to a particular sphere of justice. There should be a particular idea of justice or particular foundational principle of justice. How Rawls theory is Rawls theory is universal. It is not particular. Rawls theory is universal. Rawls theory is foundational because it is deontological theory. Rawls theory is homogenizing, but justice has to be particularist. This justice means, basically it means the same thing, that idea of justice which is relevant to a particular society should be accepted principle of justice or accepted idea of justice, right? So if matrilineality is accepted principle in Garo Khasi tribes, it is okay. That is their view on justice. If socialist socialist societies want their their resources to be held publicly, that is okay. That is their conception of justice, right? So what communitarians basically say, that with respect to a particular sphere, idea of justice which is most relevant to its people should be the idea of justice, should be the principle of justice. That is the view of Michael Walzer, and we have understood Michael Walzer's complex equality as well. We are going to understand in his concept of complex equality in more detail in equality. For now, what grounds did Walzer criticize Rawls is more important. On which grounds did Walzer criticize Rawls? That he called Rawls' theory of justice to be universal, to be foundational, and to be homogenizing. Against this, he says that justice should be particularist with respect to a particular society, with respect to a particular community. Different goods ought to be distributed in different societies in accordance to their different principles with respect to their different agents. That is the idea as given by Walzer. I hope you understood this idea. We'll start with Rawls' response to communitarian critic, and we'll try to understand his book Political Liberalism of 1993. Thank you so much. Bye.